All right,
Nice
welcome. So now you know who we are, and the lights just came on, which means I can't see any of you. And it looks like a full house from here, right?
Totally.
So I'll have to ask you to shout instead of raising your hands, but I always like to start with a few questions from the audience to know why you're here. And these categories are not mutually exclusive. So if I could hear from you if you are actively working in the self-sovereign identity space. You should woo up here on the stage. Yeah, we can do that. Okay, please make some noise if you're here because you're interested in identity as a foundation for other blockchain-based activities. Yeah? Great. And is anyone here because you have a personal concern about the future of your own digital identity? Okay, yeah, like I said, not mutually exclusive, and perhaps that should be all of us. But fortunately, we have a fantastic panel here today to talk through all of the things that are happening in the self-sovereign identity space now, and what that can tell us about the future. So I'd like to start by asking our panelists to just define the space for all of us. And in a neutral way, not yet talking about your specific companies and all the great things they do, but if someone asked you, what is self-sovereign identity, how would you answer? And maybe Amit, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, to set context, I think identity and security, which are in many ways for many customers an interrelated thing, I think most people will agree the experience is very broken today. It is a constant source of anxiety and frustration for people. Establishing identity, proving identity, anxiety about is somebody else going to steal my identity. So that's one part. Another part is that clearly the existing mechanisms don't work. We see breaches all the time. The Equifax breach is probably the most notorious in the last couple of years, where probably everybody in this room, your identity, your detailed identity, has been compromised. And that's important because it's not just, hey, your name, your social security number, but Equifax is the provider of knowledge-based authentication used by secondary services like the IRS. And so, when they ask you those 20 questions to establish your identity, well, guess what? Some Chinese hacker now has all of it. And they know more about you than you do. So this is a problem. So now the question is, what do you do about it? And I think there's three things we need to worry about or think about. There's who controls my identity, where is my identity stored, okay, and then how is it used, and who kind of validates my identity. So in terms of, I think control is the most important part. Historically, control has been delegated to large companies. And clearly they've demonstrated to us over and over again that they can't really be trusted with their identities. Okay? And so I think it's really important that the self-sovereign part is giving consumers, customers, individuals direct control over their identity. Who has access to it, who can control it, how is it shared? The storage really can be anywhere. And then the last part, which I think is a place for lots of innovation and very, very incomplete today, is how do you actually establish who you are? Is it the government? Is it somebody else?
Great.
Cool.
Anything to add?
No, I think that's a great description. I like to give an example of what is not self-sovereign identity. So, and this is actually an example that has played out on the internet today. You visit a website, maybe it's Martha's bookstore membership site where you can read reviews on books. And to get into that site, you click the button that says log in with Facebook. No problem, super convenient. I now can log into Martha's website. I use my Facebook credentials. They make sure my username and password's correct. And then one day, I post a picture of an innocent kitty on Facebook, because that's what you do on Facebook, right? Really cute cat pictures. And unbeknownst to me, it was copyrighted, and Facebook locks my account because I violated the terms of service. And now I go back to try to log into Martha's book club site and I can't log in because I don't have access to my account on Facebook. That's an example of what is not self-sovereign. I have no control over the provider that's allowing me to prove who I am online. With a self-sovereign architecture, instead of logging in using Facebook, I can log in using credentials that I create and I manage. That's a good example of what is not self-sovereign.
I love that example as someone who recently had to change my phone number and, unbeknownst to me, had complete access to another person's Facebook account that in fact wouldn't stop confusing him with me, even though he looked quite different and had been recently incarcerated, and I got a lot of messages asking for access to drugs. So I think it was more of an issue for this person than for me, but it certainly highlights how scary it can be when our identity is tied to these other companies or other digital identities that we cannot control, especially once they leave our hands. So, yeah, that's two very comprehensive examples. Drummond, do you have anything to add?
All I'm going to do is use my favorite prop to say the same thing that I pointed out yesterday. If you're wondering, it sounds like such a, lofty concept, self-sovereign identity, but in fact it works just like this. All we're doing is we're turning around and giving you the same ability to prove your identity in the digital world the way you do it today. This is decentralized. There is no one, there's no one provider of wallets in the world. There's no one provider of credentials. You can go get a credential any place you're willing to qualify for one, and you can go use it with any site or verifier, we call them, that's willing to accept it. Everyone creates their own rules, and there is no central authority for the whole thing. What blockchain technology, what's being called self-sovereign is being able to do this digitally online.
Great. It's not my panel, so I'll spare the conversation on how there used to be 1 million credit cards, and actually Visa, MasterCard emerged from an opportunity to synthesize the notion of credit. It seems to me like what we're doing here in the blockchain space is looking for a way to synthesize the many accounts that we have out there in the world into something that's a bit more reliable. So I want to ask how, for now digging into your companies and the approaches that you're taking in the blockchain space, what is your approach to self-sovereign identity on the blockchain, and why did you choose to move in that direction now? And Drummond, we'll start with you.
Oh, go the opposite direction. The approach that I'm taking, so I'm at Evernym, a chief trust officer there. Evernym actually acquired my company that was based here in Seattle, Respect Network, because we agreed that what needed to happen was self-sovereign identity be broadly adopted. It needed to be based on open standards. If it's not open standard, it can't be self-sovereign. And what we really needed was a global public utility for this purpose, very much like the domain name service, just blockchain-based. And that meant a network that basically many different parties could agree to use. And so the idea was the nodes would be run by trusted institutions. So it's a hybrid network. It's a public network, but it's governed, we call it decentralization by design. So we contributed the code to an organization called the Sovereign Foundation, which in turn contributed to Hyperledger, and it's the Hyperledger Indie project. So Evernym as a company is building solutions, but just one of many companies now building solutions on top of Sovereign as a global public utility for self-sovereign identity.
Right. Chris, what about you?
Okay, Life ID is actually a foundation. It's a pure blockchain-based identity protocol and platform. The platform itself is, to the tenets of self-sovereign identity, open and permissionless, which basically means anybody can join and use this platform. The only thing you need is a computer or a smartphone. It's a tokenized platform, which means, think of it like Ethereum. You pay for compute time with Ether. With our platform, you pay for identity transactions with an ID token. And being tokenized and being open and permissionless means it isn't controlled by any single organization or entity. And that is why it is an important, plays an important role in delivering on this notion of self-sovereign identity. So that the thing that coordinates our identifiers and the revocations that we might issue against a particular claim are available for everyone so long as you have access to the network.
Great.
So I'm a co-founder of Trusted Key, and our approach is very much around how do we enable enterprises in particular verticals to be successful in this new digital identity world. And so if you think about two verticals in particular, healthcare and financial services, both these verticals, and they are the number 2 and number 3, actually number 1 and number 3 verticals in the US economy today. So very, very large. Healthcare is 1.7 trillion, financial services about 1.5 trillion. They both are trying to go digital, both to reduce costs, to improve efficiency, deliver a better customer experience. And the sticky point in the transformation for both healthcare and financial services is identity. Furthermore, both these industries are heavily regulated, and so they can't just do random stuff. Okay? Identity really matters. Identity protection really matters. HIPAA in healthcare, financial services has something equivalent. And so there's a bunch of tools that need to be provided, a bunch of ways in which you can help enterprises onboard digital identities while remaining compliant with regulation, but paving the world for the future of self-sovereign identity. And so we believe our mission is to start by enabling enterprises to onboard their large number of customers into this world, which will lead to a future where everybody will have identity mechanisms that they can use in many other scenarios.
Great. Well, we've already used the word future an appropriate number of times for where we are in this panel. And the next section of questions that I want to ask you is about what is happening now in terms of which elements of the future are we currently building in the blockchain identity space. And so to start with, I want to ask you, where are you seeing traction or emerging consensus around issues that need to fall into place? Chris, maybe we'll start with you this time.
Yeah, so as a blockchain project, I will say that we're heavily involved in the blockchain community. So where we see the most talk about self-sovereign identity is in this issue of know your customer, which is a requirement when you're in the middle of exchanging large sums of money to make sure that you're not taking money from an entity that shouldn't be giving you money. And so this is one area of self-sovereign identity that I think there's consensus around how to do this, which is this idea that an issuer issues you a verified claim that says, yes, you are indeed who you say you are, and you can take this verified claim and hand it to think of it as handing it to the smart contract for the ICO you're getting involved with, and that smart contract could just take that verified claim and say, okay, we trust that issuer issued this verified claim, so we'll let you participate in our ICO, and we'll know that you've done your proper KYC checks. That's probably the most, in our world where we tend to be heavily involved with a lot of blockchain companies, the one we see the most.
Great. Amit?
Sure. It's been an interesting journey for us. So Trusted Key's been around for 2.5 years, almost exactly now, on today actually. And we started with this really broad, expansive vision of enabling all customers, all consumers, to have identity that they can prove themselves on Craigslist, on OfferUp, on Tinder, on wherever. Seemed like really important stuff to do. Well, it turns out that the friction of establishing identity and doing all that is so high, and at least the perception in customers' minds is the existing solutions are good enough, means that it's very hard to bootstrap directly with consumers. So we realized that we needed to find industries where the cost of onboarding could be amortized and shared across multiple participants. So where you have an ecosystem that is willing to share. And so, for example, we have a very large pilot happening with NHI-SAC right now. NHI-SAC, for those of you who don't know, is the consortium of the 400 largest healthcare providers in the country. So the largest insurers, pharmacies, hospitals, labs. And we have a pilot to basically be the identity provider for them. And the interesting thing about that scenario is, unlike in financial services, where each of the banks wants to really control identity, in healthcare, they're really interested, they are okay actually, with sharing identity with all the participants. And if you think about it, the average American consumer has relationships with 10 healthcare providers. At least 3 insurance companies, vision, medical, dental, a couple of labs, a few hospitals, a couple of doctors. Each of them has to spend time proofing you, making sure that you are who you are, because there's all these regulations that a pharmacy can't give you prescription drugs unless they know who you are. Well, the idea for us is, with this pilot is you proof once, and then that ID is portable. Okay? So the long-winded answer is to make a point that we need to first bootstrap in scenarios where portability is important, sharing is possible, and where business requirements, especially cost and a better customer experience, will drive the scenario. I think my conviction now is that it'll start in the enterprise, in the US, it'll start in the enterprise, and then move to consumer. And we can talk about more why later.
Yeah. Anything to add about that?
In building on Amit's point about ecosystems, I know it sounds strange, self-sovereign identity sounds like it's intensely personal for individuals, and it is, but he's absolutely right. The benefits actually accrue to an ecosystem. It's when you need to have portable identity, it's when you need to share across a large number of parties. And that's what federated identity systems are supposed to do, but where many of them have encountered more friction than they can overcome. So the 2 most active initiatives right now for the sovereign community, first one I talked about yesterday, ironically, it's government. It is the British Columbia government and the very, very forward-thinking team there that said, the first use of digital credentials in British Columbia won't be for individuals, it'll be for businesses. And they came up with this brilliant plan to take all, I think, 31 agencies that issue credentials to businesses, from your, corporate registration to, healthcare. Health certificate for a restaurant. All of them that issue those credentials today are going to start issuing the digital version of those credentials, and they're going to go to a central service called the Org Book, where any citizen or business in British Columbia or anywhere in the world can look up and get verified digital credentials for every business. So they're basically creating a giant directory service to bootstrap adoption of verifiable credentials. Now they are, and they have plans that are coming shortly to then extend that into the citizenry of British Columbia, because they're quite a ways down the road with what they call a services card. But that was their, that was their insight, and it's been amazing how fast they've moved and how much support they have gained within not just British Columbia, but now Canada as a whole for that use of it. The other example I'll give you is, again, to the point of whole industries, large ecosystems. The credit union industry recognized the opportunity in blockchain technology, specifically starting with self-sovereign identity, and has an entire initiative led by CU Ledger, which is a credit union services organization, to establish a standard digital credential of credit union membership worldwide. That means it's got an audience of 235 million people that, as credit unions add support for it, you will be able to get a digital credential in your digital wallet that you're a credit union member and use it anywhere in the world.
I just want to ask a follow-up question about this, because we know that early players and shapers in any industry set it on a path in terms of what norms and expectations are in place. And so based on who's been involved to date, how do you think that's going to shape the way that your work looks going into the near future? Is it going to scale to consumers faster or slower, do you think, based on who's involved? What other kinds of things are these bootstrap players asking for that might be different from what you see in terms of the potential for the industry at large?
That's a great question. I'll answer that specifically in the context of what the credit unions are doing. They recognize that all the technical capabilities are there in place now. I mean, including the open standards that we're not quite done with, them being fully approved by the W3C, for example, but they're far enough along that we can implement them, and that's what we're doing. I think the race is going to be on around credentials and which ones start to gain traction in the market, much like the credit cards, right? Which ones, and how do we really gain that network effect? The credit unions realized they had a special, they had a lead. Frankly, even though they're 7% of the financial services industry, they have the strongest trust relationships with their members. And they said, we have an ability to issue a credential to our members that is going to have more impact than any one bank. And they knew it was going to be very difficult, and there may be banks in the audience, I'm happy to talk to them, for the banks to collaborate in the same way that they could. So they said, let's leverage that trust relationship and actually empower our members, not customers, members with self-sovereign identity. So that's a particular, superpower of that credential. I think we're going to see a number of others of those, and we're going to start to see ecosystems of digital credentials.
Drummond touched on open standards, and this is really critical for self-sovereign identity, because self-sovereign identity is a new identity paradigm, a new architecture. It's really simple. There's an identity holder, and it could be an individual, but it could also be an organization, as Drummond just pointed out. There's the issuers. Those are the people that issue these what are called verified credentials, some truth about that entity, and then there's the verifiers. And the question of what segment or what vertical will take off, or who will be the major influencers, I agree. I think enterprise is going to be the most critical for this, and but at the end of the day, the one that deviates from the standards is probably not going to be the one that wins. In other words, in order for this architecture to win, we all have to start using these same standards. And that brings with it some baggage, which is the standards bodies are strong-armed by really large companies. So it's this interesting dance of trying to push this new paradigm that actually defangs them. Is that a word?
Mm-hmm. It'll work.
But working with them so that they will adopt and push these standards to fruition, because we need the standards in order to be able to have these verified credentials and these claims be interoperable in the market.
And that pushes us to the other question we wanted to discuss in this section, which is where are the blockers in this space right now? Where is there a lack of consensus, or maybe there's activity, but factions, if you will? What are the things that from your perception are getting in the way of more widespread adoption?
For me, the largest one are those enterprises that are going to push for standards that maybe aren't in alignment with those that push this self-sovereign identity architecture. That's probably the largest stumbling block for this paradigm shift that we're seeing.
I'd say there's 3 blockers in my mind. So one, so if you're Estonia, where you get to issue a digital identity to every one of your citizens and then basically enable a countrywide transformation of how identity is consumed and tracked and controlled and all that, then that's fantastic. You have a relatively homogeneous population, small country, you can just do it. The US is never going to have a national ID system. It's just not going to happen. It's not a federal matter, it's a state matter. The politics, the dynamics, culturally, for all those reasons, it's never going to happen.
Don't we, though, with the social security number?
Well, that is in some ways the worst possible mechanism for ID. It is, well, number one, it's used in a way that is absolutely not intended to. It has no safeguards against abuse. And it's also one of those things where once it's the social security number is based on this fallacy that it's somehow a secret. But yet you dole it out to everyone. And then once somebody has possession and misuses it, there's nothing you can do because you're stuck with that number for life. it is the worst possible way of implementing an ID system. I mean, you couldn't invent
And yet
a
we've
worse.
done it nationally.
It's an amazing accomplishment.
It was
right?
never intended to be an ID system.
So it is kind of like the global minima of like worst case scenarios. So one is that the lack of a national ID, which means I think at least in this country we're going to end up with a amalgamation of consortia that bootstrap this ecosystem. And I think the key thing there is interoperability, because by default all the momentum is going to be driven by control. Once you have industry playing in this, the high order bit is going to be control. In financial services in particular, identity is really about control, because historically financial banks have been able to take customer information and monetize it. And so they really want to control that identity. So by default, we'll end up with a balkanization of identity, which is going to be a terrible outcome. So I think one of the things we really, really have to endeavor to do is promote interoperability, even if there are islands. I mean, in fact, the credit card analogy you used earlier is probably very appropriate, where you can have MasterCard and American Express and Visa, and yet the terminals are the same, right? The customer experience is largely the same, right? The expectations are largely the same, right? And so we need to move to a place where even if identity gets bootstrapped in different ecosystems, there's interrupt, because otherwise, who wants to be running on with 6 IDs in their wallet and then have to go through the mental gymnastics to figure out which one do I present where? I mean, that's in some ways actually even worse than Social Security, if that's even possible.
Another blocker, blocker might not be the right term, hurdle is going to be user experience. We all know how to use this, but digital wallets are brand new, and most people in this room probably have an experience with a crypto wallet, but that's not an identity wallet, and they don't use it for interactions like every time you want to log into a site or form a new account or share some information. So there's very active work going on about that. I think all of our companies are very involved with that, but that is one thing that we have to get over. The other way I think I would characterize understanding the blockers is there's another really good analogy for what's happening besides credit cards with self-sovereign identity, and that's number portability. A lot of us don't remember, but what was it? It was early 2000s. We actually got to number. We freed our mobile numbers from being locked to a carrier, right? Well, there was industry opposition. We were a close partner with one of the companies that did not want to see that happen, right? Because it just meant they were going to lose control that they had over their customers. What ultimately won out there was the clear and obvious benefits to consumers, right, to individuals of having that. And once the legislation passed and it had to happen, it just unleashed a wave of innovation, and I think we can all agree the mobile industry benefited overall, right? The whole thing grew. That's what's going to be happening here, but we have that same. Imagine all the things that are locking in your identity at different enterprises or even at governments, all of them having to say, oh, we're all going to be better off if we actually have truly portable, strong, self-sovereign identity.
Yeah, there's a lot to overcome there that we didn't dig into in terms of culture and egos of various institutions that I'm sure is also worth addressing, and maybe we'll pull that up now that we're talking about the future. We want to spend a little bit of time projecting out into what might really happen 10, 20 years down the road, maybe even further. And for that, I just wanted to put a container around this conversation. I have a quote from cyberpunk William Gibson that I love. It says, "The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed." And often the future turns out to be the stuff that we just kind of forgot about as we were charging forward into it that comes back to haunt us. And so when we were preparing for this call, we were talking about the fact that ultimately we're looking for a trusted system that would work with any entity all over the world, just as the internet does. But there are very different operating environments, if you will, very different markets. I happen to have spent some of my career with the State Department, which does a lot of identity verification, for counterterrorism purposes, for travel purposes. We don't think of it this way, but a visa is permission for a human to move around the world, not terribly differently from how we move goods around the world. And all of that hinges on the capacity to verify that the person in front of you or the person wanting entry into the country is in fact the person that you have in mind. And the US military has spent an incredible amount of money on things like biometric tools to try to capture fingerprints and eye retina scans of folks with the hope of creating some sort of global database. We'll set aside for now the discussion of how well that has gone over in places where that technology is brand new. But I'd love to get your thoughts from where you're sitting right now, looking at, again, who's involved in this space and who's not involved. What is the future of a blockchain-based identification system look like in places where we're still pretty far away from even a basic notion of digital identity?
So this doesn't exactly answer the question, but the analogy that comes to my mind is I was fortunate enough to live through the .com era of the internet boom. And I remember everybody talking about, like, your refrigerator is going to have an IP address and all these things that were going to have an IP address. And that was in, what, 95, 96, right? Here we are, is it 2018, 17, 18? Mm-hmm. We're now, IoT is just now a thing. So what we talked about when this technology first took root took 20 years to kind of come to fruition. So I believe that there's going to be a similar path for this new architecture for identity. I think a lot of what you hear on this panel are ideas that, I hope it's not 20 years, but 10 years from now, we're going to be finally, like, we're actually experiencing this world where I'm in control of my digital information, and I hate the word digital or identity because it conjures up so many different things for so many different people. But at the end of the day, there's information about me, the relationships I have. I should be in control of them. I should get to share with whomever I want the pieces that I want to share. And that is at the heart of a self-sovereign identity model or architecture. So I think the things we're describing now, the future is, when that comes to fruition.
From my perspective, it's really about the experiences you want to enable. Can you, for example, eliminate passwords? Might seem like a trivial thing, but at the root of most cybersecurity problems that we face today in enterprises and as individual consumers is password compromise. It's also a source of giant anxiety. I mean, if you totaled up the cost of the anxiety created by passwords, I would not be shocked if somebody came up with a number of like $1 trillion, right? It's just like the human cost of remembering these ridiculous passwords and not sharing them, and Yahoo gets breached and you're wondering, hell, did I use that password somewhere else? All that nonsense. So while it might sound trivial, that alone would be a giant step forward for humanity. Okay? Another is all these experiences that and these applications that you can now enable once you have identity that is remotable, that is shareable, and under your control. So what I mean by that is, so today in the physical world, if you want to remote your identity, let's say you sold your truck on Craigslist, but you didn't have a title, okay? But you don't want to go to the DMV with the buyer. What do? You go to a notary public. Okay, they give you a document, and that document is a form of remoting your identity. Okay, that's one of the few places where that happens. But you can imagine, and the reason you do that is for convenience. You don't want to synchronize schedules with the buyer and decide when you're going to go to the DMV during business hours, blah, blah, blah. Okay? If you had the ability of remoting your identity digitally over the internet, think of all the scenarios which would now be possible where you no longer need physical presence, right? Where you can actually say, the consumer of this identity can say, I can reliably depend on this person being who this identity claims they are. Okay. And then shareable and delegatable, where you can now give this identity temporarily to somebody else to act on your behalf. Right? Now, this will open up all kinds of new scenarios which today completely depend on physical presence and really constrain human creativity and labor movement, economics. So at the end of the day, and obviously we're biased here, but you obviously think identity is at the heart of everything, right? But I think in many scenarios that's largely true.
Yeah, it's certainly at the heart of everything. It also feels contentious in ways that we maybe haven't brought up in this space before, as everyone is working so hard to figure out the basics of how blockchain identity will work across these ecosystems. But I'm very curious whether there is in any of those conversations some looking at more, maybe even some of the most common or fundamental challenges for people in terms of moving through the world with identities that are sometimes difficult to verify. If, for example, we talked about when I worked in Afghanistan, everyone who showed up seemed to have a birth date of January 1st at an approximate year, because that just wasn't something that folks were tracking, and it culturally just isn't as relevant in terms of how you identify one person from another compared to other markers of their being. And this is something that creates a lot of cultural friction when you're asking people who don't think of themselves as this or that number to fit into a particular system. We certainly have seen it for a long time with issues around people changing their names if they get married or divorced. And it's a huge issue for folks in the trans community who often need to go through a great deal of work and get proof of gender confirmation surgery just to go to the DMV and have their gender expressed on their ID in the way that they want to. It almost feels like there's a more kind of fundamental issue at play here over who has control over how you're seen in the world, and how do you give people agency over that where they feel comfortable and there's something in it for them in managing that identity, but also having it be something that fulfills all the necessary criteria to interact with all those different institutions and be certain that it's the same, that you're actually connected to the person who created it.
You just summarized the very heart of the paradox or the challenge of any identity system, but specifically self-sovereign identity systems, because the architecture that we're creating is, in my opinion, the first one that has the ability to provide the contextual sharing of identity that can meet the cultural and political and economic requirements worldwide, right? It's much like, there were a bunch of tries in internet architecture, or what we now call the internet, before we finally got to, packet-based sharing, an IP address, right? And suddenly that architecture took off. And, we're all here in this room because of that happened, right? I think we're at the same, with self-sovereign identity. That's why I think, folks go, wow, blockchain, cryptocurrency, they're not seeing that the big impact is actually, I think the biggest impact is going to be, we call it self-sovereign identity, but it's really what it is decentralized key management. That we are solving the problem of how we can do decentralized trust. At the heart of that is, these decentralized identifiers. They are really the new IP address at the level of identity instead of machines talking to machines. Mm-hmm. What that means is that the identity I share with you and with you and with you and with all the companies I have relationships with and the connected devices, they're all compartmentalized. And I can just put identity in all those contexts, which means I now have a way of managing identity I've never had before, right? It's not based on one phone number or one national ID or one view of myself. I can modulate those things, and every one of them can be trusted private relationships. Mm-hmm. We haven't had that, and it portends a whole new future for where we can go with the internet and the web, right? Centralized systems we rely on today for social connections, we all know what they are, but we've had to use centralized systems because we couldn't do that on a decentralized basis. Now we're going to be able to.
And you add to that those decentralized identifiers that Drummond is referring to, what the blockchain brings to it is portability across the whole world. So no matter where you create one of these things, the identifier, and by the way, this is my public disclaimer, I have to say this on every panel, we do not store public, personal information on the blockchain.
Yes.
That's like, I feel that as a obligatory comment for every panel I'm on. Your personal information is not what's stored on the blockchain. What is stored on the blockchain are these identifiers that you use to represent yourself digitally. And the blockchain gives us an ability for, as I said, for you to be portable in the whole world. So whether you are a refugee in Afghanistan, if you create one of these decentralized identifiers and you assign some attribute about yourself to that identifier, you get to control, you have to have access to a computer, obviously. So that is a prerequisite. But you get to control the updating of that identifier because you're the one that knows the secret of how to update it.
So, I think the example that you provided in Afghanistan is actually very relevant to this idea of confidence in the identity. Because once you onboard an identity that is portable and reusable, that bar is fundamentally different than a single-use identity, which gets re-verified every single time. The bar is fundamentally higher. I think the example you were talking about is where you say, hey, there's actually a low confidence identity mechanism, which can unequivocally and with high confidence identify that this person is who they say they are, either for cultural reasons or infrastructure reasons. Because of that, my belief is that in the future world of identity, it's unlikely that there'll be a single issuing party or a single ID that is relied on, and instead it'll be an ensemble of IDs. So for example, a relying party, in our architecture we have issuing parties and relying parties. A relying party, depending on the scenario, like if it's Tinder, they might say, hey, your Facebook identity is good enough, okay, because who cares, right? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But if you're a bank and you're about to do $1 million wire transfer, you might say, look, I want an ensemble of issuing parties that include maybe your pharmacy, there's a portable identity, maybe a notary public, maybe a scanned-in driver's license or passport, maybe your Facebook login, where each of these additively adds to the confidence of the ID, right? And it's unlikely that that same name and identity has been spoofed across all these things, right? So I think in the future it'll be an ensemble, which, by the way, is not unlike what exists in our world today, right? The way we establish identities with other people is because of that, but also social verification from other people who say, yeah, that is Drummond. He didn't just pick up a wallet from somewhere else, right?
Right. It's fascinating to just pull to the surface all of the patterns that already exist in our world that are influencing what you're able to do in the blockchain space now, as well as what you're working on moving forward. We have a very short amount of time for maybe just 2 questions from the audience if folks have things they want to say. And I can't see you, and they didn't tell me where the mics are. So
come on up. There's a mic right here.
Only request is that it be relatively short so we can answer you and in the form of a question.
My name is Sanjay. I worked in X500 and LDAP directory for a long time. And I'm trying to understand the vision of X500 directory, global directory, decentralized directory. How was that different from DID's infrastructure as PKI? That's one. And DIDs look similar to me as distinguished names, other than if distinguished names were a little less ugly, for example, starting from top and GUID, then so I'm trying to differentiate, what's so special about, and what's the difference between DIDs and DNs and X500 Global Directory and DID's infrastructure as PKI. And the third comment is, what have you learned?
I think that might be enough for us to answer right now. Thank you.
So Chris, go for it.
Yeah, that's a pretty deep one. So I'm the co-editor of the DID spec, and I'd be happy to go into it in more detail with you after this. But I will summarize it as DIDs as identifiers so they are globally unique, just like distinguished names in LDAP and everything else. The first key difference is there's no centralized authority, right? Anyone can get a DID, and they don't have to go through an intermediary to do it. So it's like a GUID that way. But the second difference is the DID is actually an address of a small JSON LD document on a blockchain, and the key there is that you can get the public key, and you can get the endpoint with which to interact with that. So you solve the problem of both discovery and key verification in one chunk, and it's decentralized, and it's also permanent. So you can do key rotation and the other things you need in PKI. So it's really a revolution. All self-sovereign identity is a revolution in decentralizing PKI. That's the fundamental piece. And again, happy to go deeper into it with you directly.
And if I could add one other thing, the individual generates it. So you generate your own DID, and basically, for most systems, I won't speak for every system, but it's a public key addressed initially, because the way you register it is you have to prove ownership of the private side of it. And then, so for our system, for example, only the creator of the actual public key pair could create a public key identifier that's unique and owned by them. And that's that initial creation is typically verified through public key cryptography. And then, as Drummond said, it points to something that allows you to update the actual public key that you want people to use when referring to that DID. So,
and one more thing about the standard, it works with any modern blockchain. So RChain, Sovereign, Verus1, there are DID methods for Bitcoin and Ethereum, IPFS. It's, that's the most base level of interoperability we're going to get with self-sovereign identity.
Then the second half of that question was, how's it different from X509? X509 is not decentralized. X509, so we all use it, you probably don't know this, but when you go to a HTTPS address in your browser, it's pulling down a certificate that was signed by an authority that your browser pre-trusted. So you've got a list of authorities that your browser trusts. With DID-based decentralized identifiers, individual creates the actual DID on the blockchain. There's no other entity that needs to vouch for it.
Got it. So we have 1.5 minutes left. We have another quick question from somebody.
I actually have one question, not a 5-part question. So this is a U.S. question. Have you run into legislative issues as you're working through self-sovereign identity across the states?
Running to legislative issues. So, as I mentioned earlier, the approach we've taken with certainly in healthcare and financial services has been to provide our customers a path which allows them to be compliant with existing regulation, while also providing a path for the future where they and hopefully their lobbyists can influence future legislation. Because at the end of the day, we are trying to be very careful about which fights we pick, right? The government tends to be a large, immovable, and not very cooperative adversary, so there's no point picking that fight. And our customers really want to be successful in their initiatives to be digitally transformative and reduce costs and provide better experiences. So having said that, I think in the next few years we will see a lot of initiatives it's similar to what is happening in BC around state. I think this will happen at the state government level, not at the county level, but at the state level, because they are ultimately purveyors of licenses in the U.S., where you'll see a lot of initiatives where licenses, identity mechanisms will be digitally issued and certified in that manner. And that's already kind of happening.
Great.
I think the key, if I can say one thing about that, the key is not actually that we need new legislation. For instance, BC Gov found that existing digital signature legislation in Canada was sufficient. What you're going to find is that existing regulations exist in many industries because they're protecting against things that self-sovereign identity infrastructure and the privacy and security guarantees are going to do more effectively. So it's going to be more a matter of saying we don't need certain regulations that we've had to have in the past, and by taking those out, we're going to remove friction from the next generation of digital commerce.
I think that's a wonderful, idealized version of how we can work with government moving forward, and a great place to end the panel. I want to thank the three of you, Amit, Chris, and Drummond, for being here, and also everyone in the audience for your interest and for your participation in the blockchain community. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.